You are now live. Yes, it shows I'm now live. Okay. All right. As if I can see that without my specs, but all right. Okay. All right. All right. Bye-bye. Hi, how are you guys? I think a number of you have joined in. We'll give it some more time. Is my voice audible? All right, great. Then we don't really need this. Perfect. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Janvi. Five minutes we'll give for other people to join in since I was late as well. But it's just to tell you, I've been a lawyer for more than 2 decades, and I've started from 30 Hazari courts. Wonderful times when I started. I mean, there were some amazing criminal lawyers. You could actually see magic happen in court. The kind of tricks of the trade, so to say, the strategies that out of the box thinking that these criminal lawyers used to adopt. I don't think you can do that and get away with it now, but those days were amazing. When I did a criminal matter, this was a terrorist matter, and I remember that the IO got confused because he had to point out the bag in which the RDX was found, and this lawyer actually got similar bags and he got them placed all over the court, and the IO was very, very confused. And that's one. Another matter I remember, this was before OJ Simpson. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And this was an interesting case because the accused who had murdered somebody, his t-shirt was taken by the police as a material piece of evidence, and by the time the matter came to trial, he had lost substantial weight and the t-shirt wouldn't fit him. And this was before OJ Simpson. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. So yes, magical times, wonderful, wonderful times. We can probably start now, and when I come to the substantial part of it, let's see who all would be there. Most of the time when I'm asked to speak on criminal law, it's more because of the cases that I've done over the years and the nature of matters that I've handled. And when most of these matters, fortunately or unfortunately, have been in media limelight, have been in the news for all the right and wrong reasons. We've handled work for a lot of politicians, ministers, chief ministers, home ministers, and we've usually been strategists and firefighters. And so those matters usually have been in the limelight, and we've been blessed to handle those matters. And I've been extensively asked to speak about those matters. There's a very senior lawyer who once told me that if you want to learn the law, you pray for one big matter. It's easier to learn law with one big matter than 100 small matters. Then he also said that that you need to do those 100 small matters very, very well and to the best of your abilities to get that one big matter. I don't think anyone could have put it in a better perspective, could have put it better. But the thing about doing these criminal matters is this, that you need to empathize with your client, not sympathize, but empathize with your client. Because if you don't do that, there won't be a connect. And if there is no connect, you will never understand the story that you have to put forth, because criminal law is not just about law. I mean, I remember a very senior public prosecutor once telling me, and what has happened is that in the 20 years journey, what I've seen is a lot of criminal lawyers, wonderful criminal lawyers, rely on precedents and judgments after judgments. So when we go to argue a matter on bail, we'll have judgments for every point. And this was never the intent. Criminal law was supposed to be a very high discretion matter for the judge, for the judiciary. It was supposed to be argued more on facts and on the demeanor of not only the client but also yours, how you're putting forth a story, a fact before the court. How are you putting your side of what really happened before the court? And it was all about courtcraft and wordplay and your conduct and the client's conduct. And it kind of changed over the years to a very law-based, a very precedent-based argument. And I was doing that. It was a very, very big matter in the High Court. Again, it was all over the papers. It was a white-collar crime. It was a cheating matter, and we were arguing that matter. And I brought in judgments after judgments on bail, and in what case, in what situation the bail should be given. There are landmark judgments that say that once the charge sheet has been filed, the accused need not then be punished by keeping him behind bars because he's no longer required for the purpose of investigation. And the senior public prosecutor knew me well, and we were talking later, and he said that, no judge likes overburdening him with judgments because even he knows that this is a discretion of the court. And we were actually discussing this, that the best kind of argument in criminal cases when you can put your plan B, your arguments before the court, and that you can put forth a story before the court and say that this could have happened, and since this could have happened, the benefit of that should be given to my client. I mean, but as I say, that systems change, customs change, but I wish that we go back to arguing the way we used to, because that was a better way of argument that's my belief. Any which ways. But since I've already, over the years, I've been invited to various forums to discuss CRPC, to discuss criminal trial. What we will do for you is to do it a bit differently. What I'll do for you is not just discuss what the sections are, which we have usually done, or what the landmark judgments are. What we are going to do for you is do something which I like. That's how I have learned the law. I'll explain the journey of investigation to trial in the way that you will relate. To me, what I have done is that I have created a flowchart in my mind, and that's how I make my notes. And what I've done is that every critical part of criminal trial, I remember one or two landmark judgments or judgments that I know I would need to understand that particular part of CRPC or criminal trial. And when I link them both, and if you're like me, you would also like this, that when you link that particular part of CRPC to a landmark judgment and to understand the precedent of what the Honorable Court has stated, you would understand it in a much better perspective. So what we will do is that this is what we will do for you. I will give you a lot of judgments. I've got to know that all of you love judgments. I'll give you a lot of judgments. I'll give you the citations. I will not hand it over to you later. I want you to note them down because you would be able to link them to what I'm trying to teach you, what you're learning from me. First of all, I really like interacting with criminal lawyers. I think you're the last bastion, the last post of democracy, of protecting the citizens, to bringing forth and protecting the law. Somebody once said that you don't get justice in this world, you get justice in another world. Here we have the law, and you are the protectors of law. Now, broadly speaking, there are 4 stages of an offense. And this is very important because when you read your FIR, you would understand, in a lot of cases, especially in white collar crimes, you would realize that you have to understand from what part of the action legal liability or criminal liability arises. So there are 4 parts. First is the idea or the intention to do a criminal act. Second is the preparation to do the criminal act, that you prepare for it. That itself does not bring forth a criminal liability except in certain exceptional cases where you're trying to wage war against the state, where there is an intention of criminal force or dacoity, etc. But apart from that, general law, no legal liability arises. Third, of course, is the attempt to commit that offence, and once that attempt is successful, then the actual commission of that offence. Now, the trick is to understand the difference on what happens when a conduct jumps from part 2 to part 3, from preparation to attempt. And here you will realize a number of cases, not just criminal cases, but not just blue collar crimes, physical harm, etc., but a lot of cheating and a lot of fraud cases also come into play. Because what would happen is somebody with the intention to cheat somebody bought papers but did not use them. Would that create a criminal liability or not? Or somebody signed in somebody's name in preparation to cheat somebody but did not go ahead with that illegal act. What would happen then? So there is a judgment that I want you guys to note down. This judgment is a landmark judgment. This judgment is of the Honorable Supreme Court. Usually in such cases, most of the criminal trial lawyers wouldn't even bring out this judgment and just say that my lords would be aware that in Yaqub judgment, which is Muhammad Yaqub judgment, it is State of Maharashtra versus Muhammad Yaqub, AIR, 1980, Supreme Court 1111. So in the Yaqub judgment, the Honorable High Court had held that what constitutes an attempt is a mixed question of law and fact, depending largely on the circumstances of that particular case. The Honorable Supreme Court also said that in order to come within the expression of attempt, the act towards the commission of offence must be in proximity to the intended result, and the act must be indicated or suggestive of the intention. So the test is the proximity test. It is different from UK. We need not go there. Proximity test is the test that you need to remember. Now, what happens is that what is an attempt? An attempt is an endeavor to do something. It is an endeavor where you've not been successful, and that you've not been successful because of a factor which is independent to your act or volition. So you wanted it, but it did not happen, and therefore it is an attempt, and therefore there is a criminal liability to it. Section 511, you can read it later, is a general section that pertains to all cases of attempt except cases of murder, except where there is punishment for life, except those punishable with death. So section 511 is something that you guys can read later. Not very important, I've already discussed it. Now the other aspect is, what are the different parts of a criminal prosecution system? Again, there are 4 parts. First part is the investigation itself. Investigation is a conduct of the police or the investigating agency. Second is the inquiry. The inquiry is never in the ambit of the prosecution or the investigating agency. It is in ambit of the court. The court inquires, the police investigates. So it would be a wrong proposition as lawyer to say that the police is inquiring a matter. The police can never inquire a matter. The police can only investigate a matter. It is important, and I will tell you why in a moment. The third part is the trial, of course, a part of the court procedure, and fourth is the judgment, and out of the judgment comes appeal, etc., etc., etc. Now, lastly, any offence can be divided as a cognizable offence or a non-cognizable offence, or a bailable offence or a non-bailable offence. Now these are very basic divides. Also as compoundable and non-compoundable offences. Now cognizable and non-cognizable and compounded and non-compoundable are already given in CRPC as tables. I would request you to just take out that table, probably take a photocopy of it, read it, make your notes on it. It would be of great help. Compoundable, non-compoundable has been mentioned in section 320 of CRPC. There are 3 parts to a compoundable and non-compoundable offence. It is compoundable, automatically compoundable at the discretion of the complainant. Second part is compoundable with the permission of the Honorable Court, and third is the non-compoundable offence. The first 2 parts, compoundable, is something which is basically not a state case per se. It's a case against a person. And these are private complaints or private wrongs. So the complainant can sit with the accused, come up with an understanding, and move to the court to compound the offence. Compounding tantamounts to an acquittal. In the first part, where there's an absolute right for the complainant to withdraw the complaint. In the second part, he can withdraw it with the permission of the Honourable Court. Third is non-compoundable. There have been certain instances where the Honourable Supreme Court has permitted compounding of non-compoundable offences, but those are very, very rare in nature. Now to come to the offences, which is the meat of the argument here, cognizable and non-cognizable offences. This is in the first schedule, first table, as I've already stated. There are tables, you can just go through those. Cognizable offences, very, very simple, are those offences where the police can arrest without permission of the court. Non-cognizable offences, of course, are those offences which the police cannot arrest without the permission of the court. Yeah. To understand a ballpark understanding would be, a thumb rule is that a cognizable offence is any offence with 3 years or more punishment, and a non-cognizable offence, thumb rule, is less than 3 years punishment. The definitions are given in CRPC in section 2C for cognizable and 2L for non-cognizable, but I have already explained it to you. Now what happens is, a person comes to the police and says, listen, I have come to know that a criminal act has taken place. He informs the police of an act that has taken place. The police makes a report of it, puts it in a register. This is the first time the police gets to know of an illegal or a criminal act, gets that information and puts that into a register. So first information report, FIR. An FIR is under section 154. An FIR is only for cognizable offence. If it is a non-cognizable offence, the IO or the police officer is going to forward that report to the Metropolitan Magistrate to ask him, listen, should I investigate this further or not? That is done under 155. The MM can permit the investigating officer to investigate that offence. If the MM permits him, the IO has all the rights of investigation except the power to arrest. Because the power to arrest comes to the IO the moment the FIR is registered. It is done on prima facie case. That is all that is required for the police officer. There are a number of judgments pertaining to FIR. One, it is not a substantive piece of evidence. Second, as defense lawyers, you should know that the moment FIR is registered, or even prior to, you can move for anticipatory bail. If you are arrested, you will be moving a regular bail. In most cases where FIR is not registered, the police, the judges, the court is not going to entertain an anticipatory bail application. In certain cases, it will put you to notice, which means that the IO is to give you 3 days notice or 7 days notice if he wants to arrest you. But in most of the cases, if there is no FIR, the courts are not going to entertain an anticipatory bail application. Now, the Honorable Supreme Court has said that an FIR is not an encyclopedia. It just has to give you the basic information pertaining to offence. There is a landmark judgment pertaining to that. You might want to note it down. It is Superintendent of Police CBI versus Tapan Kumar. This is 2003 Criminal Law Journal, 2322 Supreme Court. It has held that FIR is not an encyclopedia. It just has to disclose all facts and details relating to the reported offence. Only report lodged by informant about the commission of offence without any name is sufficient for disclosure of commission of offence, and FIR is made out. There has been certain changes in the FIR, in the law of registration of FIR. There has been an amendment under 154. In cases which are of sexual nature, rape, etc., the FIR will only be registered by a lady police officer, and there are certain other compliances that it would be videographed, and immediately a statement under 164 will be taken, which we will come to now. Now, as soon as the FIR is registered, the IO will start investigating the matter if he has not arrested you. If an arrest is done, it is done under section 41. There is a requirement, there has been another amendment, which is the amendment 41A. Read it well, because this is something that is going to entitle you to argue a lot of bails and anticipatory bail matters. Section 41A was introduced to check the indiscriminate arrest by police officers. It said that where offence is less than 7 years, instead of arrest, the IO will send a notice to the accused. If the accused joins investigation, he will not be arrested, and if there is a requirement to arrest him, a permission from senior officer would have to be taken. Landmark judgment, fantastic judgment to that effect is Arnesh Kumar judgment. Arnesh Kumar judgment is 2014, 8 SCC 273. Now Arnesh Kumar relies on two other judgments. One is the Allahabad High Court judgment, which is called the Amravati judgment. Amravati judgment is 2004 SCC online, Allahabad 1112, and it relies on a previous judgment of Supreme Court Joginder Singh. Why I am telling you these three judgments? Because once you read these three judgments, 41A will be very, very clear. I have successfully argued anticipatory bail matters, going to the court and saying that I've argued bail matters and anticipatory matters, going to the court to say that either my client has been arrested without a section 41A notice, or the police is trying to arrest me, has come to my house, is threatening to arrest me, and no notice under 41A has been given to me. At the moment I get a 41A notice, I join investigation, I create a record so that I cannot be arrested by the police. 41A, very, very good, excellent thing to learn and remember. Now a statement is recorded under 161 of the witnesses that the police wants to bring forth against you. This statement is not a substantial piece of evidence again. It can be used to contradict a witness when you're examining him, but you cannot use to corroborate what he has stated. So you can't corroborate your case, you can only contradict him. Secondly, it has to be unsigned. A police wala cannot force the witness to sign it. If it is signed, it is illegal, it cannot be signed. Third, there can be no inducement given to the witness by the police officer to make a statement under 161. 161 statement is extremely important. You will realize it's important when the prosecution brings that witness for the purposes of prosecution evidence and gets the chief examination recorded, because if the chief misses out certain things of 161, you know what the police is trying to now create a different case than what it had previously created in 161. So at that time you can either contradict if you think that it is necessary, or you would know that there are certain things that the police officer haven't, the prosecution hasn't asked, it goes to your benefit, better to keep quiet about it. Now in certain instances, especially as I said that in rape matters, in sexual harassment matters, etc., it is mandatory for the police to take the complainant and get her statement recorded under 164 from the magistrate. So this is a very important substantive piece of in CRPC, because the statement is recorded by the MM when the IO is not present, and the MM asks whether you have been under any threat, coercion, any pressure whatsoever. After the statement is recorded, it is put in sealed cover. Neither the accused nor the IO gets that statement. It is only opened in the day when of PE when that complainant is brought before the court. In certain cases, the IO can also bring in the witnesses for their statement under 164. As a defense lawyer, it is good for you, because then you can say that the IO himself did not trust his own witnesses. So after a statement is made under 164, now what we have to remember is, if the person, if the accused is arrested, he has to be brought before the MM within 24 hours, because when the law was created, the Britishers believed that the investigation will be completed in 24 hours, and if it is not completed, then he will be brought before the MM, and the MM can then let the accused go back to prosecution, so to police custody for purposes of joining investigation. There are two parts of it: police custody and judicial custody. At this moment, a defense lawyer comes and argues tooth and nail that police custody is not required, he may be sent to JC. Why you do that is, the moment a person goes into JC, you can move the bail application to say that since he is in JC, he is no longer required to for the purposes of investigation, he may be enlarged on bail. So this is a very, very important part and a very, very important strategy for defense lawyers. I can see a lot of comments on 161 statement. Yes, in Gopal Goyal Kanda matter, not only we had gone through 161 statements very, very carefully, We had created an entire chart of what every witness was saying and where every witness was digressing from another one to actually break the chief examination that was being put forth, because the story was going from A to B to C. The prosecution itself was not very clear of the story that they want to put forth. Now, another important part of this is that no accused can be put in judicial police custody for more than 15 days. It could be in piecemeal matter, 2 days, after some time JC again, but no more than 15 days can the court give police custody to the police. He will be sent back to JC, so the maximum period is 15 days. That is one important thing. The second thing is that in such a case, when the police searches a premise, it has to give cogent reasons for searching. It cannot do a rowing and fishing inquiry. There is a very interesting case called Dr. Pratap versus Director of Enforcement. Now, in this case, this is 1986 Criminal Law Journal, 824 Supreme Court. 1986 Criminal Law Journal, 824 Supreme Court. It was a wonderful judgment. The police came to find a scooter that was stolen and was trying to find it in the suitcase kept at home. The Supreme Court hauled the police up, asking them how could they envisage finding a scooter in a suitcase. So there has to be clarity of what they want to search. They cannot have a fishing and rowing inquiry or search. Now, quickly, once the investigation is concluded, the police files its entire gamut of investigation in a report which is called the police report, the charge sheet. It is under section 173. An important point here is that the charge sheet has to be filed within a particular period of time. In all cases, the charge sheet has to be filed within 60 days, and except in cases of where the punishment is 10 years plus death, life, where the time period is 90 days. If the charge sheet is not filed within the stipulated period, the accused is entitled to bail. It is called compulsory bail. All you have to do is just say that the statutory bail period, is over. He has not, the charge sheet has not been filed. He is entitled to bail. He will get bail. That is one part of it. So we've already discussed anticipatory bail, and now we have discussed compulsory bail. Now there are certain important things. Once the charge sheet is filed, the MM can do, the charge sheet is always filed before the MM. He can do two things. The charge sheet would say that, listen, no case is made out, please close the case. It is called a closure report. Or it can say that let us proceed with the FIR. In case that the police files a closure report, in olden days, the MM can of course accept the closure report, but in olden days he could accept the closure report, close the file, send it. No longer. The Honorable Supreme Court in 1985, and this is a creature of the precedents of the court, said that a closure report can only be accepted after giving notice to the complainant. So the complainant would be put to notice before the closure report is accepted. The complainant will come to the court and would be entitled to file objections to closure report or to protest, and that is called the protest petition. The protest petition having been accepted will go the complainant case route, which we will just meet in a moment. But what would happen is, once the charge sheet is filed, the MM can do three things. He can accept the report, as I've said, that then it would be a closure report, protest petition report, or he can say that investigate further, the investigation is incomplete. Or it can not agree with the closure report or agree with continuance of the case and go further. If it decides to go further, this would be for the first time that the court is actually applying its judicial mind. This is the first time it takes the entire matter into consideration. It takes cognizance of the case. This is under section 190. It is a very, very important section. I would request you to read it. It is this is the time where the inquiry, so I said investigation, inquiry, the inquiry of the court comes into play. The court inquires into the matter, sees whether the case is made out, etc., etc. Now, there is no section to protest petition. Protest petition is a creature of a judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court. The CRPC is silent on protest petition. So in 190, as I said, that In 190, it takes cognizance, and then, so there are three parts in 190. One is 190 subsection 1 subsection A, which is a complaint. As I said, the protest petition comes as complaint. Stop here for a moment. What if the police refuses to register an FIR? It says that go away, I am not registering an FIR. Then you have an option. The option is that you go to the court, you first make a complaint to the higher officers, you wait for 45 days. After 45 days, you file a complaint to the court under 156(3) and 200, which is a complaint under section 190 subsection 1 subsection a complaint case. You go to the court and say, police was not registering my case, please register my case. It would be called a complaint case. What is going to happen is under 200, the MM is going to ask you to bring bring forth you as a witness and your witnesses, your evidences, etc. And then it can either ask the police to investigate the matter, or it can ask the police to register an FIR, or it can ask further investigation, or convert it into a complaint case, or dismiss it saying that nothing is made out. But if it asks the police to investigate the matter, it goes back to 156(3), becomes an FIR, and the entire process, as I said, filing of charge sheet, etc. is done. Now, an important thing is that the MM can ask the police to investigate the matter on two fronts. One is under 156(3), as I've said, and one is under 202. Now, 156(3) is a pre-cognizant stage, while 202 is post that. On investigation, there are two landmark judgments which have stated that the magistrate cannot ask the police to investigate the matter in the manner he thinks right. Investigation is an absolute right of the IO. It is not the right of the MM. He can ask the police to investigate, but cannot say in what manner it has to investigate. A landmark judgment is Indrajit Mukherjee judgment. This is a 1995 Criminal Law Journal 3250. This is a Calcutta judgment, and this actually is a wonderful judgment. It's been referred in a number of judgments later, but this was the first judgment that said it. I would request you to read it. It is a fantastic judgment to read. Now, what happens is that once, so the second part was, of course, the first part was 190 subsection 1A, which is complaint. The second, as we dealt with, was section 190 subsection 1 subsection B, which is on police complaint, and the third is section 190 subsection 1 subsection C, which is any other source. Somebody might write a letter, or the judge might read the paper and say, oh, this is a criminal case, let me register it, let me get it investigated. But now what happens is, any of these, if the matter is not dismissed, the Metropolitan Magistrate will issue process. Issuance of process is either warrants or summons or summon warrants. Summon warrants is more of a theoretical thing. It is under 87. Either warrants will be issued or summons will be issued. And at this stage, again, once the summons or warrants are issued, the accused is duty bound to come to the court, where you are to go to the court and ask for bail or anticipatory bail. Now, there are certain questions which I'm going to answer at the same time. So now, once that is done and the process is issued, the accused comes and he asks for the charge sheet. Now, this is the first time the accused gets to know what is the case against him, what has been collected against him in the form of a charge sheet. Interestingly for you, this is also the first time the prosecution gets to know what is the case made by the investigating officer. Unlike America, we have the office of prosecution is different from the office of investigation. In America, the offices are one, and therefore there is the quality of investigation is much better because they have the benefit of the prosecutor telling them what is to be done. This is not the case here in India. Second thing, a drawback. In America, in foreign countries, in developed countries, there is something called the concept of fair disclosure. Once the IO finds any evidence, even if it is going against his case, it is in favor of the accused, he is duty bound to give that, to show that, to disclose that to the accused. There is no such obligation in India. So the investigating officer, just to create a case, can make a case, dehorse a lot of evidence that he has found, which is in favor of the accused. And then you have to fight the system, the entire government machinery, to get that evidence. How do you do that? one concept is learn the art of filing RTIs. File RTI for everything you possibly can. You will get a lot of evidence, a lot of data, a lot of information in your arsenal when you are arguing on the defense side. So very quickly, understand this, that in a cognizable case, the police can arrest without permission of the MM and investigate. In a non-cognizable offense, the police cannot investigate or arrest a person without the permission of the court. If the magistrate denies to register a complaint, then can we take the help of 482 CRPC? I will deal with 482 in a while. 482 are the inherent powers of the High Court. There are a number of powers. The powers of the High Court are very, very wide in that if it sees any miscarriage of justice, it can step in. So when the magistrate denies to register a complaint, you still have the right to go through the route of filing a criminal complaint. The criminal complaint process, as I said, is section 156, is under section 200. You may read it. You also read section 190, subsection 1, subsection A. Now, one question that somebody has asked is, can a victim change a statement under 164 CRPC? Yes, but we all know that there have been Manu Sharma judgment and some other judgments where when the witness changed his statement, he was prosecuted also. So there has to be cogent reasons to give. Still today, statements under 164 in matters pertaining to sexual harassment, rape, etc. are changed day in and day out. So I mean, this goes neither this way nor that way. Now, can IO show 161 to the complainant or witness at the time of PE without court permission? Interesting question. Once a witness comes to the court, the witness can go through the statement under 161. As a defense lawyer, one of the strategies of cross-examination are, what is actually believed by the court is a witness who has seen an occurrence will always remember it. So there is no reason to refresh his memory. But he has refreshed his memory. As a strategy, at some stage you can say that I hope you are prepared. Have you seen the statement under 161? Who showed it to you? It would go against the accused. As I said, what is the section for protest petition? There is no section for protest petition. And that you have read many cases where police has filed closure report was a civil wrong, mostly 420 cases. How to differentiate between civil and criminal wrong? Very, very good. You see, when I told you those first 4 parts, there is also something called mens rea or criminal intent. The line between cheating and the line between civil wrong is very thin. If the intent of a person was to cheat, criminal liability would come in. If from the moment he met you, the intention was to cheat, this is what the test in 420 cases is, criminal liability will be made out. What I said about the first 4 things about, what creates an offense, just go through that. That is what is going to answer this question. Now, as I have stated, that now the accused appears and seeks a copy of the charge sheet under 207. Again, a very, very important point for you. Because at this time, what is going to happen is that the IO does not want to, or the prosecution doesn't want to give you the entire charge sheet. They're going to create a lot of problems, or the photocopies will be bad, or other issues, etc., etc. This is the moment where you fight it out. You go to tooth and nail, and you say that you need an entire set of the charge sheet. If you are not getting those sets, you can move an application, and there would be a duty, except in those cases where the charge sheet is highly voluminous. In those cases, you can say that you would get it photocopied at your own cost, or now you give them a CD and you ask them to give it to you, and burn it in a CD and give it to you. So as I said that there is no law of fair disclosure. The accused is entitled to fair copies. Now what happens when the accused appears and seeks the charge sheet? After this, the court goes through the documents, the sections, etc., and this is all before the Metropolitan Magistrate, and then it is seen whether this is a warrants case, this is a summons case, this is a summary trial, or a warrant summon case. As I said, a warrant summon case is minor, we don't really have to go there. A summary trial is again minor, which is offences where maximum punishment is 6 years. warrants case and summons case would be important. Warrants case is more important for you. We're going to deal with that. A summons case is where the maximum punishment is 2 years, and warrants cases where the maximum punishment is 3 years plus. Now, what happens that in such cases, usually the cognizance is taken by the sessions court. The matter is sent to the sessions court after all the preliminary has been done by the MM. There are certain cases which are also done before the MM, but just to understand this, we will go through this together. The session court takes cognizance of this. It is committed by the MM under 193. The case is opened by the sessions court, or let us just say that the case is opened. The prosecution then argues on charge. You get to argue on discharge. A strategy at that time is that you need to create and know your case, but you need to know that you're not to disclose too much of it. Because if you disclose too much of it, the prosecution will be wiser. They will tutor the witness accordingly. So on law, on aspects which are undeniable or documentary evidence, you argue on discharge. If you get a discharge, excellent. Which is if no case is made out. If you do not get a discharge and charges are framed, you are entitled to file a revision petition in the higher court. An important point: finality of order, appeal. At this stage, revision. Basic difference for you to remember. So you file a revision against framing of charge, and if the charge is framed, then the trial commences. The various parts of trial are like this. Just a second, please. So various parts of trial are like this. First is the prosecution evidence. The prosecution evidence, the police, the investigating officer brings the witnesses. The chief examination of those witnesses take place. The chief examination is done in the light of the 161 and the documents that have been signed or filed by that particular witness. It is a very, very important step, because at this stage the public prosecutor may try to lead the witness, and you're supposed to stop him from leading the witness, or try to get those documents exhibited that cannot be exhibited, because either that particular witness is not an author, not a witness, or those documents are photocopies. So the art of cross-examination starts from the very first stage of chief examination of the witness. After chief, you as a defense lawyer get to cross-examine the witness. As I said, you can use the 161 to contradict but not to corroborate, and you can ask questions not only pertaining to that witness, but if he was a witness with another witness pertaining to the other witness itself, because he was a witness to that fact. The prosecution might get a chance to re-examine, that is their discretion. In certain cases, a witness might turn hostile. He might not agree with the prosecution case, at which stage he would be declared hostile by the court, and then the prosecution will have the right to cross-examine him. The other part of it is after PE and before defense evidence, before 133. At this stage, the court may think, oh, there is nothing against your client, and may acquit your client. This is under 232. There was an MCD scam, a very, very big matter, which was all over the papers again. We were representing, there were a number of accused. We were representing one of the accused. We had stated that there was some negligence on part of the department, but there was no mens rea, there was no criminal act or conduct, and the court did not discharge our client, but the first witness was the witness that had stated against our client. He was brought in, the court examined him, and after examining, acquitted our client in the matter. So, this is a very, very important stage. It has to be dealt with accordingly. Now, what is the purpose of framing of charge? A very, very important thing again. We did not deal with this. The purpose of framing of charge is to give intimation to the accused of clear, unambiguous and precise notice of nature of accusation that the accused is called upon to meet in the course of a trial. So the entirety of what is going to be against him is put forth in the charge. So I charge you with such and such. The accused knows what he is supposed to meet. This is the landmark judgment to this is VC Shukla versus State. VC Shukla versus State 1980, supplementary SCC 92. This is common in warrants case or summons case. The point is that a prima facie case must be made out before a charge can be framed, and a person should be discharged if no case is made out. At this stage, in certain cases, if the accused has certain documents which are unchallenged, unquestioned, then he can also bring forth those documents and show them to the court, and the court may see those documents and rely on those documents if it wants to discharge the accused. At this stage, your argument would be that there has been improper investigation by the IO. The IO has ignored material evidence against your client. A landmark judgment to that is Shakuntala versus State. This is 2007, SCC, online Delhi 304. Brilliant judgment, because in most of the cases the courts do not really allow you to file documents and to show those documents to the court. Coming back, if the court hasn't acquitted you under 232, and then what is going to happen is that the court is going to put questions to your client, to the accused. The questions would be, I put to you, this is what is against you. This would be questions under 313. This is a very, very important step. Some 10-15 years back, it wasn't supposed to be that important, because what used to happen is that all you had to do is I deny, nothing at all. But now what happens is, that the court wants something more. So this is the stage where you also put forth your case before the court, and so you're developing your case against the case of the prosecution. You know where there are two stories and two stories before the court, and both stories are equally believable, then the benefit of doubt will always go towards your client. There are two questions. Application of section 91, you will have to actually explain what do you mean by this, and do we have to file an application under 232, or does the court do it on its own? Give me a particular instance and I would be able to tell you better. I just want to meet these 3 points more. So once these statements are put under 313, what happens is that the accused at that time puts forth his case. The Honorable Supreme Court has said that each and every allegation, each and every case, each and every fact has to be, that the court is going to rely in passing judgment, has to put to the accused. If it is not put, it is gross miscarriage of justice. There are a number of judgments that also say that, merely on this there would be no acquittal. The High Court or the Superior Court can also ask these questions at a later stage, but it's still quite a material stage. There is a judgment again, Ashraf Ali versus State of Assam, and this is 2008, volume 16, SCC 328. It said every circumstance appearing against the accused must be put forth to him specifically and separately. Failure to do so would vitiate the trial if the accused is shown to be prejudiced thereby, or it results in miscarriage of justice. At this stage, the accused is asked if he would like to lead evidence or not, and if he would like to lead the evidence, then the next stage comes. Now, the other stage is defense evidence. Defense evidence is taken place in the 223, the same process as prosecution. Here the defense brings its witnesses, the chief takes place, the cross is done by the accused. If there is a requirement to re-examine, then re-examination takes place. Now the question that was asked was on section 91. I don't really know what was the question. If the question is about production of documents, then yes, you can ask. If, for example, there are certain documents, you can seek disclosure, or you can ask that those documents are brought forth, but usually the court allows you to bring forth those documents in defense when you are doing your DE, defense evidence. Now, after defense evidence, final arguments take place. Now, the final arguments, just a second, I think there's certain other questions that are asked. I'm trying to get this to the end of it. Right. I think what we will do is that we will quickly conclude, or we can have the second session now. I am going to disconnect and come back again, and that is how we can start the next session. No, we still have 7 minutes. Let's try and finish this and then see what else we can do. So yes, so then comes the final arguments. In the final arguments, either the court is going to acquit your client or will pronounce a judgment of guilt or conviction. If there is guilt or conviction, in case of guilt, the second stage would be quantum of sentence. What is the kind of punishment that would be dealt with, and then you can either file, then you, or if there is an acquittal, an appeal is filed to the higher court, session court, whatever. This is always after the conclusion of trial. The relevant sections are 372 to 394. A landmark judgment to this is Niranjan versus State. This is 1978 Criminal Law Journal 636, which says that if the judgment is not signed during the pronouncement process, the delivered judgment will be considered irrelevant and void in nature. You see, what has happened in a number of judgments, a number of cases, is the court has kept the matter after final arguments for judgment and stated that this is what the judgment is going to be, but the judge changed or something else happened and the judgment was not signed. That judgment is no judgment in the eyes of the law, as has been held by the Honorable Supreme Court. Now, as I said, so now the appeal can be either against conviction, it can be against acquittal by the other side, or it can be as to the adequacy of sentence, the quantum of sentence. Let us disconnect and reconnect again. I think that is required. Oops.